I'm Andy Gordon, and it's going to be my pleasure to talk to you about research which I had done some time ago. And the purpose of the research was to understand the relationship between drinking and culture. Of course, drinking creates culture, culture creates drinking. I think the funders of the research at the time, which was the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, which is part of the National Institutes of Health, just sort of threw up their hands and said, we don't know what to do about the problem of drinking problems or alcoholism or people who have problems with drinking, whatever. And they, in search for another explanation, another way of handling these difficulties of ameliorating the epidemic levels of alcohol use in some populations and all of the health and social problems that come from it, they developed a program whereby myself and others went out among cultural groups in the country, wrote about the ways in which they drank, tried to explain how they drank as they did, the motivations for drinking, and what they did about these problems. And this was a program of postdoctoral fellows, which is, I guess, another way of keeping on working when you don't have a professor's job, or when you have a professor's job and you want to do something else. This was at Brown University, and I'm very indebted to them for that experience of just having 2 years of sitting down and writing about this, finding out about different cultures, and drinking sometimes with the people with who I was working. And when I first came on the scene at Brown to work in this area, I was given a choice. Well, whom do you want to work with as an ethnic group? Because we were to choose one or another ethnic group. And Rhode Island had Colombians, people from Colombia. They had many people from the Azores. There were others who were from Portugal. And there was a substantial Hispanic population which was there as well. And that was part of the south side of Providence, Rhode Island, where Brown was. So I said, okay, I'll study the Hispanic population and their drinking. And one of the very important things that I've learned, and one of the features of the research which has made it specifically valuable for people in social services and health services, is that there is just such a tremendous variety of approaches to alcohol, to drugs, to treatment, to designated disease entities like alcoholism and addiction, from group to group. So I didn't really study Hispanic drinking as such, but I looked at the different Hispanic groups. There were 3 different Hispanic groups, and the experiences of each of them were so terribly different, and the drinking styles and drinking problems, or the absence of drinking problems, was so terribly, striking. And I wrote about this and went around the country and talked about it. And I'm going to be talking about it today because this is a course which we're doing, a course on comparative cultural studies, and today I'm going to be comparing different cultural experiences with regarding alcohol use. Now, the 3 groups who I was working with in Providence, Rhode Island, the south side of Providence, Rhode Island, were Dominicans, people from the Dominican Republic, which is 2/3 of the island of Hispaniola, the other third of it being Haiti, Guatemalans, that is in the country of Central America, and Puerto Ricans, who the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, which is formally part of the United States, but has a Commonwealth status. To give you an example, to give you an idea of the number of people with whom I was working, there were 7,000 or so Dominicans, 1,000 Guatemalans, and 3,300 Puerto Ricans. I think there are considerably more. This is a quarter century after the research that was done now, but the issues are very much the same, and I think many of the drinking patterns are equally equally the same. Let me just give you a word about how I did it. I'm an anthropologist. And anthropologists do work like no other people. When we want to find out what is going on with people, what they behave, what they think, we hang out with them. We spend time with them. I guess in that sense, the work we do is clearly empirical, in that everything that we learn it face to face. We learn it by observing, by listening to people, by doing the same things they are, by, to a degree, becoming a part of the scene. Now, when I was working on alcohol use, of course, I'm sorry, I had to spend a fair amount of time at bars, at parties, but there was another side to it as well. Because not only was I studying alcohol use, I was studying what people did when they had alcohol problems or when they were alcoholics. So the time that I spent in bars, at parties, dances, clubs, and stuff like that was offset by a number of hours I logged in Alcoholics Anonymous, in a charismatic Catholic group, which was extremely helpful to people, in church, and in Catholic Church, and as well in Protestant Pentecostal churches, which had a very strong message that drinking ain't so good, one shouldn't go it. So I had both entities there, and I was working with two sets of people, and both were very much coming from the culture itself. Now, very briefly, I talked about differences. Most astonishingly, everybody says migration, oh, people are stressed, they drink more, but among Dominicans, I found them drinking considerably less. Migration had that effect on their cultural patterns of drinking. Among Guatemalans, well, they drank more. And I'll try to explain that. And among Puerto Ricans, well, Puerto Ricans, because of their very distinctive relationship with the United States and U.S. culture, they got also involved in the U.S. drug culture of the period. I'll start off by talking about the Dominicans. That was the first case that I studied, and I worked in the Dominican Republic for about a year. This was after my first experience working in Rhode Island, in Providence, Rhode Island, is that they drank less, as I said, and they went from one cultural mode to another, cultural mode of heavy drinking. They have a word in the Dominican Republic to describe a distinct set of male behaviors, and in each of these cases, I'm going to be talking about male behaviors of drinking, because in each of these cultures, men are doing most of the drinking. Of course, I will be making reference to the impacts of women on the scene and how women react, how they suffer, and how alternatively they try to change it. Now, I said we'd talk here about Dominicans and how they were in the Dominican Republic. There is a word which describes Dominican behavior in this way of being with wine, women, and song, and that word is the parrandero, the one who makes a parranda, one who gets out of the house maybe on a Friday evening and will go off to the bar, may go off to a girlfriend. Not uncommon in the era of the 60s and 70s, 80s, and even beyond, that one would go to a second wife, or maybe to the prostibulo, and I'll let you figure out what a prostibulo it is as it sounds. So one was a parrandero, and one is a parrandero. One would go on these sprees, these walks, a parranda. One would go away, and this sort of construct of behavior was a male ideal. Not all men were like this. Let me say very briefly, but it was a male idea in the Dominican Republic, and in which there would be drinking sprees. And Dominicans in Rhode Island would talk about how they were. Oh, we were so careless, they would say. We would take money for the house, which was destined to buy to buy milk, and what would we do? We would go buy rum. And it was a life of wine, women, and song. But it changed. It changed dramatically. Went from being an hombre serio in the Dominican Republic to went from being a parrandero to being the hombre serio. I'm sure you figured what that is about just by the words itself. A serious man. This was a way that people spoke about themselves, to becoming into a vida sana, a healthy life, a life which was not polluted by alcohol. And instead of drinking sometimes every day, or for 4 or 5 day weekends, people would drink 1 day a week. And instead of drinking beer, they would drink scotch. But they just wouldn't drink ordinary scotch. If any of you are scotch drinkers or heard about people who drink scotch, you will know that when you're drinking Johnny Walker Black Label, when you're drinking Hagen Hake Pinch, when you are drinking Chivas Regal, you're drinking the top level of scotches. And instead of drinking very quickly and consuming as much beer as possible, the attitude was to drink suave. Now, drinking behavior changed enormously. Now, why did drinking behavior change so terribly? That's a question we would want to ask. It involved a cultural change because the cultural change informed the new drinking styles. Men became different. They became much more serious. If someone was to drink too quickly, they were becoming indecent, indecente. How did it change? Okay. What you found, or what one finds, being in the streets of the south of Providence, hanging out with Dominicans, which is what we do when we're anthropologists, we hang out all the time. I heard continually the word economizar, progresar, and sacrificar. To progress, to economize, to sacrifice. You see what happened here in Providence is that for the first time in people's lives, they were given the opportunity to have steady jobs. It was no longer occasional farm work or close to subsistence farming. They got real wages, very often in the jewelry industries around Providence. Not only did they have wages, but they had the opportunity of a housing market which was extremely favorable. It was in an area of town which was, becoming somewhat run down, decrepit. Houses weren't worth very much anymore, and the government started a program so as to recover the neighborhood, to recover the housing. They provided housing at far lower rates with not difficult to get bank loans. So Dominicans who were dirt poor, let me say that, which is not necessarily how they saw themselves, but how we might describe them, walked into an extraordinary possibilities of being small capitalists. They could get jobs, they could save money, they could buy houses, and having been in a culture where you know how to work with your hands, they could spend a lot of time improving their houses, improving their lives, working on cars. It was a tremendous shift. Let me say a word about women too, because men got jobs, but women got jobs as well. And when women get jobs, who had not had jobs before, when women become empowered, with the salary which they hadn't had before, their relationship with their men changes. They no longer have to put up with their husband who goes, well, takes some pesos and goes out and buys a bottle of rum and not milk. They say, you go out and you buy that milk. If you don't buy that milk, I'm leaving. They would say, yo poncho la tarjeta, I clock in, just like you. They don't have to take that stuff anymore. So women very much kept things on keel. But what really kept things on keel in Dominican culture here was the investment in new behaviors, the change in the environment, which in fact changed the culture, the change in the environment, and here we're talking about the economic environment. And a number of features in Dominican life in Providence supported these changes. I mean, almost if you had to write a script for how does a culture change so as no longer to be self-destructive through alcohol, no longer to spend all one's money on booze and to ruin families and relationships and not properly bring up children, you look at the culture of Providence, Rhode Island, and you see all these things going on. Well, for one thing, as I said, you give economic opportunity. Let me just put this on the board here, economic opportunity. Secondly, you have supportive institutions. And one of these supportive institutions was the Catholic Church. But it just wasn't the Catholic Church as you and I may know a Catholic Church, not that we're all Catholics, but we know pretty much what goes on in a Catholic Church. This was a Catholic Church that was going through its own worldwide transformations. There was and I'll say this for the Spanish people and then said in English, el movimiento de la renovación carismática, the charismatic renovation movement, which it was deeply spiritual, it was very, very expressive. It talked about an enhanced and liberated sense of connecting with God, and it was also very much part, of what is called the theology of liberation. The theology of liberation in the 1960s and 1970s was a movement of the Catholic Church, largely in Brazil, but elsewhere in Latin America, which saw Christianity as perhaps Christianity was been at the time of Christ, a religion which emerged so as to protect the interests of the poor and the oppressed and work for issues of social justice. It wasn't just the theology of liberation. The papal encyclicals from the 1880s on reflected this, but it was a very powerful movement, and it was also a movement which was very much fused with Marxist or socialist ideals. And as people who had problems with alcohol were encouraged to become part of the movimiento, and this was to enhance, empower people to increase their self-esteem. There was also in the church itself at that time, there was a movement of the cursillos, C-U-R-S-I-L-L-O-S, in which church members would start to take over many of the functions of the church. It was empowering, and they would say about drinking, well, drinking is not good. It's okay to drink a little bit, but he who drinks too much is not an amante of God, a lover of God, and therefore is not as well loved by God. So there was the church there. When people were drinking too much, they were encouraged to be part of this Catholic renovation movement. A second phenomenon, which was very important, third phenomenon, which was very important, was the social club. Very interesting to go to the social club. I went to some parties there. At the social club, the etiquettes of drinking were very different. Before, men used to go into a bar, they would drink alone, or there would be sex workers around. But at the club, which was called Los Trinitarios, referring to the three valiant men who struggled for independence of the Dominican Republic, it was not men only, and there were certainly no sex workers, but there were men with their wives, with their children, with their compadres, or fictive kin. They would sit around tables. This was a family affair, and it was not only a family affair, but it was a family affair which was struck by, we call, conspicuous consumption, where we would see each table adorned with a bottle of the very fine scotch. And people would speak generally as a result of these three phenomena of a new spirit in the Dominican community. It was part of the discourse, as we say. Understanding of self, Dominican community understanding itself, whereby words such as economizar, sacrificar, progresar seem so very important. So the culture here, very interestingly, reconfigures, changes the drinking itself, and so frequently, and I think always, not always, but quite often when we go to a new country, whether it's Italy or Puerto Rico, Mexico, France, we talk about how people eat and drink. Well, how people eat and drink so much informs their culture, but it doesn't define the culture, because from the culture itself, the forms of eating and drinking will change. Guatemalans, though, instead of thinking about economizing, progressing, sacrificing, having a vida sana, we're drinking more. Let me, if I might, I had written very much a typical weekend night among Guatemalans, rather different than this Club Los Trinitarios. And what I had written is, on Friday, men leave their factory, go home, clean up, rest, have dinner, and at 8 p.m. start arriving at an Italian-owned beer and wine bar, which we'll call Taglio's, which is one of the two Providence bars frequented by Guatemalans. In one of its rooms, with a serving bar and stools, the Guatemalan presence is rarely perceptible. A clutch of regulars, all white Americans, sit on bar stools, sip draft beer, enjoy a casual conversation, and watch sporting events on television. This room of Taglio's closely resembles many other working men's bars in the city. However, in the second room, where Guatemalans do their drinking, a distinct cultural presence is immediate, and it is intense. Seated in 8 booths meant for 4, but now each holding 5 or 6, Guatemalans display a passion for conversation rarely seen among Dominicans. Each booth houses at least 2 animated conversations that may cover a wide variety of topics: politics, fishing, women, their past, their futures, their bonds of friendship. After 45 minutes at one table, a Guatemalan man may pick up, change tables, or give saludos to others and continue to talk at another table. New combinations at the booths continually reform. This is no ordinary Providence bar. It is a traditional cantina of Guatemala, whose ambience beckons Guatemalans, their compatriots, Now they've arrived at around 8. At 8 p.m., many leave Taglios and go for La Casita, a Guatemalan bar across town, also frequented by blacks and Puerto Ricans. At the Casita, they may find a woman, see familiar faces, dance frequently to the local Guatemalan band. At midnight, some come back to Taglios to drink during the last hour of bar service immediately before closing. 6 packs of beer are bought in order to continue drinking in a companion's apartment. Their drinking in all its manifestations is not suave. Speed, amount, inevitable drunkenness is remarkable. It starts in the following way. On arriving at Taglios at 8 p.m., someone will buy a round. After 10 to 15 minutes, one who has finished his beer will buy another round before the others are finished with their first. A third round will be bought by an especially fast drinker just as people are starting their second beer. A newcomer may join and buy yet another round. All this taking place in 25 minutes. Thus, someone may be drinking beer number 2 and have 2 more beers waiting for him. As the beers and waiting build up, so does the pace of drinking. At a table of 4, it is not unusual to see a dozen bottles in a booth, with only a small percentage of them being empties. Through the night, drinking at Taglios and La Casita continues in this manner. At 1 p.m., drunkenness is obvious. Some fall asleep, others are assisted home, those still capable by 6-pack. Between these 2 bars, one may see 70 different Guatemalans on a Friday or Saturday night, and this does not account for those who drink at home to avoid problems, and those who go to American bars. According to personal accounts and observations, it appears that the Friday night intake per person may run between 20 to 30 beers. The routine is repeated on Saturday with apparently greater intake sometimes on Sunday afternoon. Some still are there to drink off their hangover, as they say, quitar la goma, take away the gumminess. Many spend the next 10 to 12 hours there with only short respites outside to go see a girlfriend, to visit, eat, or sleep for a while, and then they come back. During the weekdays, drinking tapers off. Only a few drink at Taglios or La Casita, and most of the drinking is done at home and in smaller quantities, but it starts up again by next Thursday. A couple of things I'd like to mention about this process here of drinking is I've presented this description to classes of undergraduates, and they looked at this thing of, well, I buy a beer, they buy a beer for me, back and forth and back and forth. They said, well, this is what we do in fraternities, this is what we do all the time. And I said, yes, this is very much part of what is going on, and it is a process of continual reciprocity back and forth, this buying drinks. Where they drink, this place called Taglios, which is not known as Taglios by Guatemalans, but is known as pichelis, meaning pitchers and spaghettis. Pichelis somehow became pitchers and spaghettis, I don't know. But at pichelis, one goes and drinks, and one reciprocates purchases of drinks, one has bought drinks, one buys drinks for others, one connects with other Guatemalans, one exchanges information about where to go to find a job, one finds a place to sleep for the night, one may get news of what is going on back home, one is part of the community again. And in being part of this community, interestingly enough, what holds this community together is not really the drinking, but the secondary benefits of being part of the drinking scene. And there are so many benefits to being part of this scene, of being an area of continual reciprocity and where the action is happening, And you can find out about jobs, you can find out about work, you can find out about a place to go, you can get a loan for money. It's known, Picelli's is known not just in Providence, but I've talked to people around the Northeast. Everybody knows about Taglios or Picelli's, everybody is there. At these tables, the attitudes are such that there is no shame to drunkenness. As a matter of fact, there's almost a glorification of drunkenness. You ask someone how they are, and I'll use the slang here and then tell you what it refers. Un poco jodido de chupar, a little screwed up as opposed to drinking so much. Chupar is to suck. Or they will say, I'm shot, tirado. They was sort of an expression of their social expressions of drinking as such were a dramatization, an articulation of their struggle. But Dominicans here, they didn't have this struggle. Why did one have this struggle and the other one not have this struggle? This is an important question. And it's a question, too, which has many important policy implications, I think. Guatemalans drank alone, they drank with other guys. Dominicans, by and large, were with their families and they put all of their excess money in their homes, in their cars, in saving for the future, making better lives. Guatemalans, on the other hand, were continually involved in investing their money that was available in social relations. Okay. Why are they different? I think the difference you can find is a result not of culture in the sense that there's something in Guatemala which is something different in the Dominican Republic, though clearly there are differences there. The differences can largely be ascribed to the fact that when Guatemalans came here, they came here after changes in immigration policy. For Dominicans, when they came, largely in the 1960s, they were able to come with families. There was a family reunification policy. And men were able to come with their women. When you come with a man and a woman, there is a social organization for investment and enterprise to build. Guatemalans, how do they come to the United States? Well, they get a visa to go into Mexico, and then they cross the border illegally. They go to California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Phoenix, and many wind up in far-flung places like Providence, because Providence, the migra, the immigration force, is not so terribly strong. They are a society of single men, and single men notoriously throughout the world will evolve patterns of drinking, spending time with each other, investing the relations. This does not mean that they fail to spend the $25 or $50 or $100 a month they fail to send at home. They still do that, but after a few years, they meet new women, their wives, their families are more distant, they start a new life, and they forget their homeland. Okay. Now, we spoke about Dominicans having a culture which is very much oriented to the holding down of alcohol use, the discouraging of it. What do Guatemalans do, and how do they do it, and why do they choose something different? This is a very good story, and I haven't completely answered it, but I can tell you what I know. That Guatemalans, when they had drinking problems, they went to AA. And there was a group, an AA group in the south side of Providence, which was Guatemala. There weren't any Salvadorans there. There weren't Mexicans, there weren't Puerto Ricans, there weren't Dominicans, they were all Guatemalans. Not that there's anything in AA which says, only certain people can go there, but the ways in which they talked, they used what they called their caló, their slang speech. So a Puerto Rican walking into an AA meeting wouldn't know what's being talked about. And there were all of these references to their homeland. And part of AA, for those people who've been fortunate enough to see an AA meeting, it's an interesting cultural performance, is to give one's history about how they happen to find a better life. They give what they call their tribuna, their tribune, their history, which in English is sometimes referred to in a slang way as a drunkalog. And they talk about their lives beforehand. And one of the things that they talk about in their tribunas is about how previously they were so macho, and now they are humilde, with humble. They're no longer so terribly intent on drinking and occasional violence. In these tribunas, in the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, they didn't stop being Guatemalans as such. There were things that they used the speech, they referred to home places, events. They would describe themselves in a way with rather extraordinary eloquence, because the Guatemalans were very eloquent people. They would sing, they would recite poetry. They would talk about going from place to place, from city to city, and all of their adventures, and they would describe themselves as a pícaro. A pícaro is one who travels around. Some of you may have heard of the picaresque novel of early modern Europe and before, where the hero or the pícaro of the novel would go from the monastery to the barroom, travel from city to city, and just have this very colorful life. They saw themselves as being pícaros. But there was a very interesting, I thought, similarity between Bichelis, the bar, and the Alcoholics Anonymous, because they were both very important arenas whereby people could connect with one another. And Guatemalans all over the United States are aware of each other in AA meetings. Yearly they go and visit the tomb of one of the founders of Guatemala, Bill W., in Ohio. Guatemalans gravitate quite a good deal to Alcoholics Anonymous. At the time of my research, there were 230 meetings of Guatemalans meetings in Guatemala. And a meeting could have anywhere between 5, 10, 15, 20, 40, 50 people. The governor and the president and the vice president, governor's president and vice president of Guatemala in the 1960s told the population that AA is the way to go. For the new Guatemalan man, let's go to AA, and they made it a very popular thing. In New York City, there were 22 AA meetings, and 8 of them were entirely Guatemalan. And this is a city where there were very, very few Guatemalans. So there was this possibility there in AA to reconnect, to reciprocate, to be part of the cultural community. AA, like the Catholic Church, has a significant effect not only on the 20 or so Guatemalans who would come to meetings continually, but on people who would drop by just to see what was going on. I remember one evening I was there at one of the many AA meetings I went to, and the fellow got up and said, fellow got up in his tribuna afterwards, he said, "You are here to see what is happening. If alcohol hurts your family, your job, your health, you'll be back again, but you'll be back again after many years, and then after much sadness." What was happening in this Alcoholics Anonymous meeting is that a new definition of alcoholism was being propagated, of being out of control, of being progressive, and eventually deteriorating one's life. So there was a balance there in this Guatemalan community. Let me reiterate that the Guatemalan treatment, you never see Dominicans there at the meetings. They wouldn't understand what was going on. And at the church, totally dominated by Dominican Catholics, you would never see, very rarely see Guatemala. Now the third case, which I was eager to talk about, was the case of Puerto Ricans. And here, I want to emphasize that we're not talking about all Puerto Ricans within the community, but talking about a specific group of them who drank in the patterns common of historically of Dominicans and Guatemalans in Providence, of drinking over the weekend, what we would call a fiesta pattern. It's Friday, it's time to enjoy yourself. But not only had they picked up the pattern of drinking of Puerto Rico, this fiesta pattern, but they picked up the American working man's drinking habits, whereby one drinks after work and goes to the working man's bar. So there was not simply the fiesta pattern, there was the American laboring man's pattern. And for reasons which are largely explainable by the proximity of Puerto Rico with U.S. culture, I mean, Puerto Rico is part of the U.S., they picked up the phenomena of the drug culture with a passion. They used to speak of people in the U.S. who took drugs all the time as garbage heads. Well, in the Puerto Rican community here, they would speak of, and with a certain degree of humor and celebration, of making a bomba, having whatever kind of alcohol and cocaine and marijuana together. And they would speak of those who are what are called atómicos, atomic bombs, who were inclined to drink and take drugs in this sense. As I look at the Puerto Rican context, Puerto Rican migration was somewhat different. Dominicans and Guatemalans were drinking very differently. Their cultures evolved very differently, but they were working. At this time in the country, there was a high degree of unemployment among Puerto Ricans, and there was also substantial opportunities to find welfare. So people were in large measure unemployed, on welfare, and because of the aid to families with dependent children, the AFDC regulations, men could not live in the homes of their wives. If they did, they would not, the wives and the children would not get welfare payments. So men were peripheral at best, and sometimes not economically feasible to have around. This was a horrific situation for someone who is descended from Puerto Rican culture, whereby above all one should be padre de la familia, one should be father to the family, one should have dignity. The system of welfare, the unemployment was such that it took away one's honor, one's self-esteem, one's family, and what seemed to have been left in this vacuum was alcohol and drugs. But all cultures not only have their problems, but also develop solutions, or look to solutions to lower the tensions, the stresses that would exist. For Dominicans, we see the church, and we see the varying institutions which reinforce a life which is abstemious, serious, economically engaged, progressive. In the Guatemalan community, we see the AA almost as a crisis cult, a form of social organization which solves many of the social needs that was solved by the bars. But what is going to come out of Puerto Rican culture? And this was, if we had to design a solution, a very interesting question. There was an answer. They were the Pentecostal churches, the Iglesias Pentecostales, whereby it wasn't a change of culture or a building on culture, such as you see with the Guatemalans and Dominicans, but it was wholesale, a complete elaboration of other cultural forms. The cultural form of the Pentecostal church, in which people would enter into a social enclave and sing and pray and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And not infrequently they would say that I have accepted God and left welfare, the sin of welfare. There were 4 Pentecostal churches, each of them in different parts of the South Side, who were very, very powerful and offered a refuge, that offered an opportunity, that offered an alternative. I want to make a couple of comments in kind of reflection on what I'm talking about. Maybe talk a little bit further about these individual cultures. We have terrible habits in this country, and we have terrible habits as human beings, is stereotyping, of thinking, well, there is a Hispanic way, there's a European way, there's an African American way, but there is extraordinary differences. Sometimes these differences happen because of the conditions under which people enter the country. Sometimes they're because of political and economic systems whereby welfare is given out, or houses are available, or jobs present themselves. That what we call culture is not something which is centuries old, which keeps on going, but culture is continually being reformed by economic, political, and governmental policies and practices. We find people adapting to the new constraints of their environment. And often we as anthropologists understand the ways in which we collectively think and behave in similar fashion as that which accrues from adaptation. And so we start to think, this business about drinking or not drinking, or taking drugs or not taking drugs, this is an adaptation. And if we want people, for whatever reasons, for reasons of health or morality, or taste, to change their behaviors, it's very difficult to change people. But we see how very clearly people collectively change and new cultures form when environmental changes take place, because we are all creatures of our environment. I'm going to stop here. I know I'm going to be seeing many of you in class. I want to talk more about this, I hope you give some thought to what you've seen around you about drinking and taking drugs, and how it's so very much an outcome of the conditions in which people find themselves, and how certain shared behaviors and thoughts and attitudes accrue from these conditions. Thank you. Enjoyed talking with you. Bye.